What happens when Sebastián Piñera crashes Gabriel Boric's live town hall, only to get silenced by one sentence that the whole country is still replaying? The crowd didn't know what had just hit them. It was supposed to be a calm, primetime town hall on a Tuesday evening in Santiago, Chile. Gabriel Boric was seated under the bright studio lights, jacket unbuttoned, tie loosened just enough to signal ease without losing professionalism. He was speaking about the strength of democracy and the importance of civic participation when the moderator's earpiece crackled. A few seconds later, the air shifted. "Presidente Boric," the moderator stammered, looking directly at the camera. We've just been informed that former President Piñera is calling in." Gasps fluttered through the audience. This wasn't scheduled. No one expected a former president to break into the current president's event, let alone live on national television. The control room scrambled. Producers waved frantic hands behind the glass. The moderator looked like he'd just been told the building was on fire. Boric didn't blink. He simply leaned back in his chair, one hand resting on the armrest, the other lightly pressing his chin. His expression was calm, almost amused. "Put him through," Boric said with that slow, deliberate cadence people had come to recognize. The screen above the stage lit up. Piñera's face appeared via phone feed, his voice booming through the speakers. "Gabriel, tuve que llamar," Piñera started. "I'm watching this whole thing and it's a disgrace, a total disgrace. You're sitting here talking about democracy when under your administration, the economy is stagnating, insecurity is rising. Under me, we had growth, stability, the best numbers. People know it, everyone knows it, nobody's seen anything like it before." Some in the audience shifted uncomfortably, others murmured. This wasn't just unusual, it was a clash of eras, live and unfiltered. Boric didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to the crowd, let the silence hang, and then spoke as if he were having a private conversation in someone's living room. "Well," he said softly, "looks like we've got company tonight." Laughter erupted, the tension broke just enough, but only for a moment. Everyone could feel where this was heading, a showdown no one had rehearsed for, one that could go viral in seconds. Piñera, sensing he had the upper hand by interrupting, doubled down. "People remember how bad things were before me, the social unrest, the lack of investment. I came in, I fixed it, and the numbers don't lie. If it wasn't for me, this country would have been in ruins. And now you want to sit here acting like you did something good? You didn't, Gabriel, they know." His words weren't polished. They were loud, forceful, designed to dominate, but they carried weight because he was a former president, still a figure of power. The audience, though, wasn't looking at the big screen anymore. Their eyes were locked on Boric. Everyone wanted to see what he would do. Would he take the bait? Would he respond with anger? Would he let it slide? Instead, Boric leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped now, and looked into the camera. He didn't match Piñera's volume. He didn't rush. He spoke with the steadiness of a man who had been through battles before and understood the value of timing. "Mr. President," Boric said, pausing to let the words hang in the air, "I think the Chilean people are less interested in who shouts the loudest and more interested in who actually offers them a path forward." The crowd erupted in applause. The moderator shifted in his seat, partly relieved, partly nervous at where this might lead. The clash was no longer hypothetical. It was happening. Piñera jumped back in, his voice rising, but something had shifted. Boric's calm response wasn't just about the words themselves. It was about tone, control, presence. Viewers at home could feel the contrast in their gut. One man storming, the other steady, unshaken. In that moment, the room no longer belonged to Piñera. It belonged to Boric. But this was only the opening shot. What came next would turn a political confrontation into one of the most replayed live television moments in recent memory. But before the night was over, Boric would deliver a single line that made history. Long before Piñera's unexpected interruption, the night had been designed to feel steady, thoughtful, and reflective. The network had set up a town hall at the Centro Cultural Gabriela Mistral, GAM, a vibrant cultural space downtown, surrounded by universities and historic buildings. The stage was simple, two armchairs angled toward each other, a coffee table with 2 glasses of water, and an audience arranged in a half circle. The invitation to Boric had been pitched as a conversation, not a debate. The idea was to let him speak about the bigger picture, democracy, social cohesion, and what it takes for a country to hold together when everything feels fractured. Cameras panned across the room, capturing faces of teachers, students, workers, and retirees. Some had Boric shirts from his campaigns, faded but still worn proudly. Others were just curious to see what the president would say now that politics had become louder, sharper, and far more combative. The moderator, a seasoned journalist from Santiago named Felipe Rojas, started the evening with easy questions. "Presidente Boric," he said, "when you look at where we are right now, what worries you most about the health of our democracy?" Boric leaned back in his chair. "I worry," he said slowly, "that we've started to confuse performance with leadership. We've got politicians who think if they trend on social media, they've done their job. But leadership isn't about getting likes or retweets. It's about whether you actually make life better for the people who trusted you with their vote." The crowd applauded softly. It wasn't the thunderous type of applause you hear at rallies. It was measured, thoughtful. The kind that comes when a line lands because it feels like truth. For nearly 40 minutes, the conversation flowed in that rhythm. Boric touched on voting rights, the importance of listening to people outside your bubble, and the challenge of misinformation spreading online. He didn't name Piñera directly, but his words carried a shadow that everyone in the room recognized. A young woman in the audience, a public school teacher from Valparaiso, raised her hand. "How do you keep believing in the system," she asked, "when so many people are losing faith in it?" Boric smiled gently. "That's a fair question. Look, the system has never been perfect. It wasn't perfect when I ran, it wasn't perfect when Allende ran, and it won't be perfect for your students. But here's the thing, it only works if people like you stay in it, if teachers, nurses, small business owners, if everyday folks keep pushing, keep holding leaders accountable. That's the lifeblood of democracy. Without it, all you've got is a stage show." People in the crowd nodded, some wiping their eyes. The energy wasn't electric, but it was steady, like a fire that warms slowly instead of flaring up all at once. Meanwhile, behind the cameras, producers monitored the broadcast carefully. Ratings were solid, trending upward on social media. Clips of Boric's words were already circulating. Hashtags with his name were climbing on Twitter. For some, the event felt like a reminder of a principled approach to politics. For others, it was a direct contrast to the noise they'd grown used to in the present. That's when the first text alert came into the control room. La Moneda is watching. No one thought much of it. After all, the presidential palace always watched. But then another note came. Former president might respond. The director exchanged a nervous look with the floor manager. Respond how? Through a statement, a tweet, a press secretary briefing? By the time the moderator moved on to another question about voter participation in Chile, it became clear this wasn't going to be a normal night. The staff could feel something building, though they couldn't predict what. Out in the crowd, a veteran from Rancagua raised his hand and asked, "Presidente Boric, what's the one piece of advice you'd give to any leader in office right now?" The room got quiet. Boric tilted his head, considering. "Well," he said, choosing each word carefully, "I'd say this, when you're a president, you don't get to just talk to the people who like you. You've got to talk to everybody, even the folks who didn't vote for you, because whether you like it or not, they're still your boss. That's the job." The answer landed. It wasn't sharp, it wasn't flashy, but it carried the weight of experience. People applauded again, some leaning forward in their seats. Back in the control room, though, alarms were practically ringing. Former President Piñera wasn't going to let that go. Not tonight, not on live television with millions watching. But no one expected he'd go further than a statement or a tweet. No one expected him to break into the broadcast himself. The moment it happened, you could feel the entire room stop breathing. Felipe Rojas, the moderator, had just wrapped up a question about misinformation when his producer held up a small white card, waving it frantically from the edge of the stage. Felipe squinted, adjusted his glasses, and glanced at the note. His lips pressed together. He cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. Ladies and gentlemen, I've just been informed we have something unusual. Former President Piñera has called into the broadcast. The audience gasped in unison. A few whispered to each other. One older man in the back muttered, "You've got to be kidding me." Boric, still seated comfortably, crossed his legs and rested his elbow on the chair's arm. He looked amused, as if he'd been expecting something like this all along. "Go ahead," Boric said smoothly. "Let's hear him." And just like that, Piñera's voice blasted through the speakers. The feed wasn't video at first, just audio, rough and unpolished, the kind of sound you'd hear on speakerphone. "Gabriel," Piñera barked, "I had to do this. I couldn't sit here and let you run your mouth on television without saying the truth. You're leaving this country weak. You're leaving it broke. And under me, we had the strongest economy ever. The strongest. People say it, economists say it, you know it." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some booed, others laughed nervously. The studio staff scrambled, camera operators whispering into headsets, producers pointing at monitors. Within seconds, though, Piñera's face appeared on the giant screen above the stage. It wasn't polished lighting or a press-ready setup. It was Piñera in real time, sitting behind a desk, his tie perhaps a bit askew, his expression sharp. "You were a failure, Gabriel," Piñera said, his voice echoing through the hall. "And you're trying to rewrite history. But history doesn't lie. People remember the economic stagnation, the lack of growth, the social instability. It was a mess. I fixed it. Nobody gives me credit, but I fixed it." Boric waited. He didn't speak right away. He simply folded his hands in his lap and studied the screen, as if he were examining an old rival chess player making his first move. The audience held its breath. Felipe Rojas tried to reclaim some control. "Presidente Boric," he said carefully, "we appreciate you joining us, though this wasn't planned, but..." Piñera cut him off. "Of course it wasn't planned, because nobody wants me here. They never want me here. But people watching at home, they do want me here. They want me to speak the truth. And the truth is, Gabriel, you're overrated. You always were, and the biased media keeps giving you airtime, keeps pretending you're some kind of hero, but you weren't. You weren't." Some in the crowd shouted back. A young man in the second row called out, "Let him finish," while another yelled, "This isn't your rally." The clash of voices only heightened the tension. Boric finally leaned forward, resting both elbows on his knees. His tone was even, deliberate. "Well," he said softly, "I guess we're breaking new ground tonight." The line got a laugh from the audience, easing the tension, but only for a second. Piñera kept going, his voice rising. "People know I did more in 8 years than you've done in 2. I brought investment back. I rebuilt the economy. I stood up to the forces that sought to destabilize Chile. You didn't do that. You didn't do any of it. And now you sit here acting like some wise man talking about democracy? You don't know real stability. You don't know strength." The audience was split, some groaning, some booing, others clapping as if watching a boxing match. Boric exhaled slowly through his nose, then raised his eyes to the camera. "Mr. President, people at home can see what's happening here. You're shouting, you're repeating yourself, and I think what they want tonight is clarity, not noise or boys." That sentence alone shifted the air. You could see it on people's faces. A man in the third row leaned forward, whispering, "He's got him." Piñera's image flinched for a second, as if the comment had cut deeper than expected. But he snapped back. "Clarity? The only clarity is this. Without strong leadership, Chile loses. With me, Chile wins. That's it. That's the story." The words hung in the air. Boric stayed still, watching. The silence stretched. Every person in that studio could feel it. 2 men, 2 presidents, locking horns in a way no one had scripted, no one had rehearsed. The moderator tried to jump in, but it was too late. This wasn't his show anymore. It belonged to them. But the real clash hadn't started yet. The fireworks were only beginning. By now, the air inside the GAM was thick with tension. It wasn't the kind that fades with time. It was the kind that pulls everyone to the edge of their seat. Viewers at home leaned closer to their TVs. People in the audience gripped the arms of their chairs. Even Felipe Rojas, the moderator, could barely keep his voice steady as he tried to steer the conversation back into control. But Piñera had no intention of slowing down. "Gabriel," Piñera said, jabbing his finger toward the camera as if Boric were sitting across from him. "You were a disaster for this country. Look at the numbers. Look at the economic growth. Look at the public order. I came in and fixed every mess you're creating. The stock market hit records under me. Unemployment lowest in decades. People were winning again. That's what I gave Chile. You gave them speeches. I gave them results." The audience stirred, some booing, others clapping, but no one looked away. Every eye remained glued to the stage, waiting for Boric's response. Boric leaned back, hands steepled in front of him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look irritated. If anything, he looked like a man who had heard this tune before and knew it by heart. "Well," he said with measured calm, "I think people remember that when I took office, the country was grappling with the aftermath of a pandemic, social unrest, and significant economic challenges. So yes, we've worked hard to navigate that. Our focus has been on strengthening public services, protecting social rights, and ensuring a more equitable future. By the time my term ends, I believe Chile will be a more just and cohesive society." A wave of applause rippled through the crowd. Piñera jumped back in instantly. "Fake numbers. Totally fake. Everybody knows it. You twist the facts. You talk about social rights, but I brought stability and prosperity. I made Chile respected again." Boric raised his eyebrows slightly, as though Piñera's outburst had proven his point. "Respect," Boric said evenly, "isn't about how loud you are in the room. Respect is about whether people trust you, whether our democratic institutions trust us, whether ordinary Chileans believe their leader is leveling with them." The room lit up again with applause, louder this time. Someone shouted, "That's right," from the back. Piñera smirked on the screen, shaking his head. "You always talk pretty, Gabriel. That's what you do. Pretty speeches. No action. Me, I'm action. People wanted someone strong, someone who fights. That's why I won twice. And you're struggling. That's why I'm sitting here, and you're struggling there." The line landed like a punch, and the audience braced themselves. Piñera was using the very fact of his past presidencies as the ultimate card. Boric, however, didn't blink. Instead, he leaned forward just enough to close the space between himself and the camera. "You're right," he said plainly. "You won elections. That happens in democracy. But winning doesn't mean you stop listening to people who didn't vote for you. It doesn't mean you spend every day attacking your critics or instead of doing the job. The presidency is not a trophy. It's not about you. It's about them, the people who sent you there." The audience roared, clapping so hard the moderator had to raise his hands for quiet. The contrast between the two men was stark. Piñera fiery and combative, filling the air with volume. Boric calm but cutting, carving his arguments like a scalpel. Piñera snarled back, "You don't get it, Gabriel. People love me because I fight. I fight the biased media. I fight the left. I fight the destabilizing forces. You bow down to them. You gave away the country. People know it. That's why I'll always be remembered as the president of progress." The mention of his legacy drew murmurs through the crowd. Some booed loudly, others jeered, while a few die-hard Piñerista supporters in the audience clapped. The atmosphere was more like a prize fight now than a town hall. Boric smiled faintly, shaking his head as though he just heard a tall tale. "You know, fighting everybody isn't the same thing as leading anybody. Anyone can pick a fight. The real question is, can you build something? Can you leave people better off than you found them?" It was subtle, but the audience felt it. Boric was circling closer, pressing in without raising his volume. Piñera's face reddened on the giant screen. "I built the strongest country in the region. You left it weak economy, weak public order. I made it strong again. Everybody knows it. That's why they cheer me at every rally, thousands of people, the biggest crowds anyone's ever seen." Boric chuckled softly, and that chuckle sent a wave of laughter across the audience. He didn't even need to speak for the room to feel where the power was leaning. Felipe Rojas glanced nervously between the two men, his papers trembling slightly in his hands. This was no longer a Q&A session. It was a showdown, live and raw, and the crowd could sense it. Boric hadn't even drawn his sharpest line yet, but what he was about to say would flip the entire exchange on its head. The room felt like it was vibrating with energy now, the kind that makes every breath sharp and heavy. Viewers at home could feel it too, the split-screen image, Piñera beaming in live from what looked like his study, and Boric seated in the GAM, was surreal, like two heavyweight fighters circling each other. Only this wasn't a boxing ring. This was democracy live on primetime television. Piñera leaned forward on his desk, his voice louder, cutting through the air like a siren. Gabriel, you're frustrated. That's what this is. You're frustrated because I'm remembered for economic success, not you. I built the strongest economy in history, the lowest unemployment. Everybody was winning under me. Farmers, workers, entrepreneurs, everybody. Under you, nothing but instability, division. His words weren't measured. They were machine gun bursts, firing as quickly as they came to him. The camera zoomed in on his face, flushed and animated. The audience was split. A pocket of boos clashed with scattered claps, while others just stared in disbelief at what they were witnessing. Boric let it all play out. He didn't interrupt, didn't talk over him. He simply sat still, shoulders relaxed, waiting for Piñera to burn through the fuel. When the former president finally paused for air, Boric straightened his posture, adjusted his microphone, and spoke with a voice so calm it cut sharper than any yell ever could. Mr. President, he began, the Chilean people don't need you to list off numbers like a salesman. They don't need slogans. They don't need another round of who's winning and who's losing. They need leadership. And leadership isn't about making yourself the hero of every story. It's about making sure the story is about them. The audience burst into applause. Some stood up, clapping with both hands high in the air. Piñera shook his head aggressively on the screen, his lips curling into a half smile that looked more like irritation. Oh, give me a break. You talk like a professor. People don't want lectures, they want results, and I gave them results. Look at the stock market, Gabriel. Look at the job numbers. Look at the investment. You were a weak president, and that's why we had to back it to fix everything you were undoing. Boric leaned forward slightly, resting both hands on his knees, his gaze steady and direct. His voice was soft, but every word was deliberate. You know, Mr. President, the job isn't just about who can build the biggest crowd or claim the biggest numbers. Numbers can go up and down. Crowds can cheer one day and boo the next. What people never forget is whether you respected them, whether you told them the truth even when it was inconvenient, whether you treated them like citizens and not props. The audience clapped again, this time louder. Someone shouted, "Díselo." Tell him. Piñera's face twisted with frustration. Truth? You want to talk about truth? You lied about everything. Failed constitutional process, economic chaos. You're leaving this country divided, weaker than ever before. I came in and brought it back. People know it. They cheer me everywhere I go. You can't even fill a gymnasium now. Boric chuckled lightly. He didn't deny it, didn't get defensive. Instead, he tilted his head as though he were studying a puzzle piece. You know, I've been in office for 2 years and I still get invited to talk to young people, teachers, veterans, community leaders. I may not prioritize stadium crowds, but I get something better. I get to look folks in the eye and know that my work is focused on making their lives a little more stable, a little more just, even when the path is complex. That matters to me more than any poll. The crowd roared. It was the loudest applause of the night so far. Piñera's eyes narrowed on the screen. Stable? You call losing investment stable? You call handing power to radicals stable? No one believes you anymore, Gabriel. They believe me. They believe what I say because I don't sugarcoat it. I tell it like it is. The words hung heavy in the air. The moderator tried to interject, but Boric raised a finger gently, signaling he wasn't done. Mr. President, he said calmly, telling it like it is doesn't mean you're telling the truth. Sometimes it just means you're saying things loudly enough that people stop asking questions. But leadership isn't about noise. It's about honesty. The reaction was immediate. Cheers, claps, even a standing ovation from the left side of the room. Cameras caught the stunned look of people whispering to each other, "Lo tiene, lo tiene. He's got him, he's got him." Boric stayed seated, composed and unflinching. Piñera, though, fidgeted slightly in his chair, shifting his papers, adjusting his tie. It wasn't panic, but it was discomfort. Visible, undeniable discomfort. Felipe Rojas, the moderator, cleared his throat nervously. "Gentlemen, if we could..." But there was no pulling back now. The clash had moved past economy and numbers. This was no longer about policy. This was about truth, character, and how each man carried himself in front of millions. But Boric was saving something sharper, a line that would echo long after the cameras stopped rolling. The studio was electric, every eye locked on Boric, every ear tuned for his next word. Piñera had just rattled off another barrage of boasts, claiming he alone had rebuilt Chile. But the energy in the room had shifted. Boric wasn't rushing, he wasn't snapping back. He was waiting. Piñera leaned closer to the camera, jabbing his finger at the lens. "You're a talker, Gabriel. That's all you ever were. You talk pretty, but you don't get results. I'm a doer. People wanted a fighter, and they got one. That's why I'm remembered, and you're struggling." Some in the crowd hissed, others shook their heads. The moderator sat frozen, barely able to hold his composure. Boric inhaled slowly and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. His voice lowered, not louder than a living room conversation, but that only made the room lean in closer. "Mr. President," Boric began, "there's something you still don't understand about this job. It's not about making everything about you. It's about making people feel seen and heard, even when they didn't vote for you. Because when you only fight for yourself, you're not leading, you're just performing." The crowd erupted in applause, but Boric wasn't finished. He raised his hand slightly, quieting the room, his eyes still locked on the camera. "You brag about building the strongest economy, but leadership isn't measured by how many times you say the word success. Leadership is measured by whether families feel secure, whether kids have opportunities, whether people can look at their president and feel like he respects them." Piñera rolled his eyes on screen, smirking. "Blah, blah, blah. People don't buy it anymore, Gabriel. Nobody's buying it." Boric tilted his head slightly, as though he had been waiting for that exact interruption. He paused just long enough for the silence to grow heavy, and then he dropped the line that would be replayed for days across every network, every social feed, every dinner table conversation. "Mr. President," Boric said evenly, "when a leader needs to constantly remind people of their achievements, it often means those achievements haven't truly reached everyone." The words hit like a thunderclap. The audience gasped first, then erupted into a standing ovation. People were clapping, cheering, some even stomping their feet. Felipe Rojas's mouth dropped open before he quickly pressed his lips together, trying to hide his shock. Piñera blinked rapidly on the screen, visibly rattled. He tried to fire back, but his voice cracked slightly. That's nonsense. People know I succeeded. They know it. Look at the polls. Look at the growth." But his words were drowned out by the roar of the crowd in Santiago. Cameras zoomed in on the audience. A young woman in tears, an elderly man clapping so hard his glasses nearly fell off, college students jumping to their feet. Boric didn't gloat, he didn't smile. He just sat back in his chair, calm, collected, letting the moment speak for itself. When the applause finally died down, he added softly, almost as an afterthought, "Chile doesn't need a performer-in-chief, it needs a commander-in-chief for its people." The room exploded again. Felipe Rojas could barely keep order. Piñera's face flushed red, his jaw working as he struggled to speak over the noise. "This is fake, totally fake. It's staged, folks. It's rigged television," he barked. But his words carried less weight now. The audience had already chosen their winner in that moment. Back in the control room, producers exchanged stunned glances. They knew they had television history on their hands. Twitter was already lighting up. Clips of Boric's line were racing across the internet, people typing frantically. Cuando un líder necesita recordarle constantemente a la gente sus logros. When a leader needs to constantly remind people of their achievements. It was a line made for sound bites, but more importantly, it was a line that carried truth. People could feel it. Boric turned his attention back to the moderator, his face as calm as it had been when the night began. Felipe, he said, let's get back to the questions. I think the folks here came to talk about the future of our democracy. It was the ultimate flex. He had landed the knockout punch, and now he was moving on as if the fight hadn't even fazed him. The audience roared again, but Piñera kept shouting, his voice rising higher and higher. You're weak, Gabriel. You're a weak president. Nobody respects you anymore. Boric didn't respond. He simply took a sip of water, set the glass back down, and waited for the next question. It wasn't just the line itself that silenced Piñera. It was the way Boric said it. Calm, deliberate, undeniable. A sentence so sharp it cut through the noise of an entire political career. But the real shock wasn't just how Boric handled the moment. It was how the country reacted once the camera stopped rolling. The GAM was roaring, applause, cheers, laughter, the kind of energy that shakes a building from the floor up. Boric's line had landed like a heavyweight punch, and the audience was still riding the wave of adrenaline. For a moment, it felt less like a town hall and more like a live concert. With Boric the performer who had just dropped the line, everyone came to hear, even though nobody knew it was coming. Piñera, however, wasn't ready to concede the spotlight. His face filled the giant screen, flushed and tight. He pointed into the camera again, his voice rising louder to claw back control. Don't be fooled, folks. This is fake news at its finest. Rigged TV, totally rigged. You're clapping because that's what the media tells you to do. They tell you to cheer for him. They tell you to boo me. But out there, out in the real Chile, people know I'm right. They know I delivered. Biggest growth, biggest numbers. The strongest country we've ever had. The audience booed, drowning him out. Some people laughed, others shouted back. One man stood up and yelled, "Te acaba de enterrar." He just buried you, which sent half the room into a frenzy of claps and whistles. The moderator, Felipe Rojas, looked like he wanted to crawl under his chair. He shuffled his notes, cleared his throat, and tried to break in. Presidente Boric, former President Piñera, we appreciate your time, but perhaps we can return to... Piñera cut him off immediately. No, Felipe, don't try to silence me. That's what you people do. You silence me, you silence my supporters, but not tonight. I'm the president. I don't get silenced. Boric leaned back again, his face calm, even slightly sympathetic, like a teacher watching a student unravel during a debate. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The silence itself became part of his counter. The cameras cut briefly to the audience. People were whispering to each other, shaking their heads, grinning in disbelief. It felt historic. Two presidents live on national television, clashing in real time, with no script and no filter. Finally, Felipe turned back to Boric, desperate to steer the event back on track. Presidente Boric, shall we continue with the next audience question? Boric gave a faint smile and nodded. Of course, let's hear from the folks who came here tonight. The crowd applauded again, eager to move forward, but Piñera wasn't ready to let go. You're not gonna get away with that line, Gabriel, Piñera snapped. You're not. It was a cheap shot, totally cheap. People see through it. They know I'm winning. Everybody knows I'm winning. Look at the polls. They're massive. They're incredible. Nobody's ever seen numbers like mine. The desperation in his repetition wasn't lost on the audience. A few groans filled the air, while some people shook their heads in disbelief. Boric finally leaned forward, his tone still steady. Mr. President, with all due respect, I think the Chilean people have already heard your case. Maybe we should let them hear from each other now. The line drew another round of applause. Piñera tried to jump back in, but the noise in the hall drowned him out. The moderator seized the moment, calling on a middle-aged veteran in the audience. The man stood, his voice strong but measured. With all due respect to both of you, I served under administrations from both parties. And I'll tell you this, what we need isn't another shouting match. We need a leader who can actually bring us together, not tear us apart. The audience cheered again, the veteran's words adding fuel to the fire. Boric nodded at him, grateful. Piñera shook his head on the screen, muttering into his mic, "Fake veteran. They plant these people. Total plant." The comment drew a chorus of boos. At that point, even Felipe couldn't hide his unease. "Mr. President, I think we've taken enough of your time this evening. We appreciate your input, but this event was meant to focus on President Boric's perspective. Perhaps we can continue with that." Piñera scowled, his face darkening. "Fine, but you'll see. You'll all see the people are with me, not him. Me." The feed abruptly cut. The giant screen went black. The room exhaled collectively, like a pressure valve finally released. A woman in the front row shouted, "Gracias!" and the hall broke into laughter and cheers. Boric sat quietly, allowing the noise to swell before speaking. When the audience finally calmed, he leaned toward the microphone and said, "Well, that was unexpected." The dry humor sent the hall into laughter again. Felipe sighed audibly, adjusting his tie. "Presidente Boric, I think we should move on." Boric nodded, smiling faintly. "Let's do that, because the future of our democracy is too important to get lost in the noise." The audience applauded once more, but the night had already taken on a life of its own. Boric had landed his line, Piñera had sputtered in response, and the clip was already racing across phones and tablets, faster than anyone in the room could imagine. But the real chaos was waiting outside these walls, where media outlets and social platforms were about to turn the exchange into the story of the week. By the time Boric finished the town hall and shook hands with the last audience member, the world outside had already changed. The moment he delivered his one-liner to Piñera was clipped, captioned, and circulating across social media before he even left the stage. In Valparaiso, baristas at a late-night coffee shop crowded around a phone behind the counter, replaying the clip with wide eyes. In Concepcion, a group of university students huddled in a dorm common room, shouting in disbelief as Boric's words replayed on loop. In Santiago itself, people leaving the GAM were already live streaming, shouting to friends, "Escuchaste eso? Escuchaste esa frase? Did you hear that? Did you hear that line?" News outlets jumped on it immediately. CNN Chile flashed a banner, "Boric silencia a Piñera con respuesta en vivo." Emol played the clip back-to-back with commentators practically giddy, one saying, "That might be the sharpest, most devastating line I've ever heard on live television." Even Bio Chile, usually critical of Boric, couldn't ignore it. Their anchors shook their heads and argued over whether Boric had crossed the line or whether Piñera had walked right into it. But the internet had already chosen its narrative. On Twitter, the quote was trending worldwide. Memes exploded. Boric seated calmly with captions like, "Cuando te dicen soy el mejor, y tú respondes, y la gente lo siente?" When they tell you I'm the best, and you respond, and do people feel it? TikTokers stitched the clip with everything from sports highlights to comedy skits. Even Chilean celebrities, actors, athletes, musicians jumped in to share it. By midnight, Boric corta a Piñera was the #1 trend in Chile. Inside La Moneda, staffers scrambled. According to reporters, Piñera was furious, pacing his home office demanding a response. He called aides into the room, insisting they draft talking points. But by the time any official statement was ready, the story had already sprinted far ahead. On CNN Chile, clips of Boric sipping water after delivering the line were shown with dramatic pauses, commentators calling it a mic drop moment. On TVN, a panel replayed the audience's reaction. Cheers, clapping, gasps, saying, "That's not just a crowd reacting, that's a collective release." People knew they were witnessing history. Even late-night comedians, barely an hour after the event ended, had already rewritten their monologues. One joked, "Piñera llamó para molestar a Boric, y Boric básicamente le dijo, 'Señor, está gritando porque no le queda nada.'" Ouch! The live studio audience howled. Meanwhile in Santiago, reporters chased audience members outside the GM. One university student, holding her phone up, said, "I've never seen anything like it. He didn't even raise his voice, he just said it, and Piñera had nothing." Cable news replayed that soundbite too. By morning, newspapers across the country had plastered the quote across their front pages. El Mercurio led with, Las palabras de Boric atraviesan la fanfarronería de Piñera. La tercera rana headline, Town Hall Histórico tras la respuesta de Boric a Piñera. Even international outlets picked it up. BBC, The Guardian, Al Jazeera, each noting how surreal it was for a former president to interrupt the current president Eve on television. Piñera's allies rushed to spin it. Senator Andres Chadwick appeared on a morning show, insisting the president was disrespectful. He insulted a former head of state. That's not statesmanship. But the clip was too powerful to be walked back. The internet wasn't dissecting civility, it was reveling in the spectacle. Commentators called it a generational moment. For older viewers, it recalled the sharp debates of the past. For younger viewers, it was the perfect meme, short, cutting, replayable in seconds. In living rooms across Chile, families argued. A retired couple in La Serena shook their heads saying, "Por fin, alguien se lo dijo claro." Finally, someone told him straight. In a diner outside Temuco, truckers debated whether Boric had been clever or disrespectful. In a high school classroom in Concepcion, students played the clip on repeat, some laughing, others stunned at how rattled Piñera looked. The moral weight of the exchange began to crystallize. Tone mattered, presence mattered, and when set against Piñera's firestorm of words, Boric's calm line had exposed the contrast in the sharpest way possible. On social media, one tweet went viral with millions of likes. Boric no le gritó a Piñera. Boric le habló con la verdad. Boric didn't out-yell Piñera. Boric out-truthed him. The media frenzy only grew as political analysts joined in. Commentators on Radio Cooperativa called it a turning point in how Chileans would remember the Boric-Piñera dynamic. On Canal 13, a panelist said, "That single sentence reminded people that restraint can be more powerful than rage. That's why it worked." Boric himself said nothing afterward. His aides confirmed he went back to La Moneda, ordered a late meal, and didn't watch a minute of the coverage. That silence made it even bigger. While Piñera's team scrambled to defend him, Boric's quiet confidence told its own story. By the second day, the clip had been viewed tens of millions of times online. It was being dissected in university lectures, replayed on morning radio, and quoted in Sunday sermons. The words had slipped out of politics and into culture. But the most powerful impact wasn't on the headlines. It was in the conversations happening around dinner tables, classrooms, and workplaces across the country. The morning after the town hall, Chile woke up buzzing with conversation. It wasn't just politics junkies dissecting every word. It was everyone. The clip had crossed out of the news cycle and into daily life, into barbershops, diners, classrooms, and offices where people rarely agreed on anything political. In Valparaiso at La Peluqueria del Puerto, 3 men sat in the chairs while clippers buzzed in the background. A customer named Ricardo, a retired dock worker, leaned forward as the TV in the corner replayed Boric's line for the 5th time. He slapped his knee and laughed. "Hombre, lo dejó mudo sin siquiera alzar la voz. Así se hace, con clase." The barber, twisting the chair with his foot, chimed in, "Se le veía la cara a Piñera. No estaba preparado para eso. Está acostumbrado a que todos le griten de vuelta. Boric simplemente lo cortó con calma." In Rancagua, a waitress at a roadside diner balanced 3 plates on her arm, while a group of truck drivers at the counter argued over coffee. One of them, a burly man in a faded baseball cap, shook his head. "No me importa lo que digas. Piñera tiene razón. Los números no mienten. Él sí arregló las cosas." Another driver countered, jabbing his fork at the air. "¿Arreglar cosas? Anoche lo asaron vivo. No pudo con una sola frase. Mi esposa ni siquiera sigue la política y estaba aplaudiendo al televisor." The waitress smiled quietly to herself, hearing the exchange. For her, the power of the line wasn't about politics, it was about tone. Boric had reminded her of her grandfather, steady, firm, saying just enough to win the argument without shouting. On a university campus in Concepcion, students replayed the clip on laptops between classes. One group gathered in the student union, laughing and cheering as Boric's words echoed again through tinny speakers. A freshman said, "Esta es la primera vez que veo a alguien realmente meterse bajo la piel de Piñera." Como que no pudo darle la vuelta, simplemente se congeló por un segundo. Her roommate shook her head. Ni siquiera fueron las palabras, fue la calma. Como que podías ver que tenía el control todo el tiempo. Eso fue lo que lo afectó. Meanwhile, in Santiago itself, locals who had been in the audience couldn't stop retelling the story. María José Herrera, a school counselor, told her neighbors, se sentía en la sala, como piel de gallina. Lo dijo tan suave, pero pegó tan fuerte. Nadie olvidará ese momento. Across the country, news anchors collected these small testimonies. TVN interviewed a factory worker in Talcahuano who said, no suelo preocuparme por Boric, pero anoche, respeto eso, lo manejó como un caballero. Canal 13 featured a group of veterans from Punta Arenas discussing how leadership is about composure, not shouting. Even conservative radio callers admitted Piñera looked rattled. Social media remained relentless. Twitter feeds filled with side-by-side memes. Piñera gritando en un micrófono en una mitad de la pantalla. Boric bebiendo agua con calma en la otra, con la leyenda volumen versus sustancia. On Instagram, influencers who rarely mention politics posted stories saying, por esto el tono importa. Not everyone was laughing, though. Piñera supporters dug in, flooding Facebook with posts insisting the event was staged, that the network had cut Piñera's mic to make him look weak. They shared grainy screenshots claiming evidence of manipulated audio. The counter-narrative was fierce, but even among Piñera loyalists, there was quiet acknowledgement that the moment didn't play well. In small-town diners, in grocery store checkout lines, in union halls and Sunday church gatherings, the story was the same. People talking about esa frase. It was the rare political moment that didn't require context. Anyone who heard it understood why it stung. The life lesson hidden in those words was what people kept circling back to. Parents explained it to their kids as an example of not letting bullies control the room. Teachers used it in classrooms as proof that composure could defeat noise. Coaches even quoted it at practice. No tienes que gritar sobre ganar, solo juega bien el partido. You don't have to yell about winning, just play the game right. In some ways, it stopped being about Boric or Piñera. It became about leadership itself, what it should look like, what it shouldn't. That night, as families sat in living rooms across Chile, clips replayed on televisions while conversations stretched late, a mother in Antofagasta turned to her teenage son and said, "Ves, por eso no siempre la persona más ruidosa es la que tiene razón. A veces es la que mantiene la calma." Her son nodded, eyes glued to the screen, absorbing the lesson without another word. But as the nation debated and digested, one truth was becoming clear. This wasn't just a TV moment, it was a cultural marker, and it would leave echoes in politics long after the applause died down. When the dust finally settled, the country found itself replaying not just a line, but a moment. The sight of Boric sitting steady, almost motionless, delivering a quiet truth that left Piñera rattled, was burned into people's minds. It wasn't the theatrics of a rally, it wasn't the noise of cable news. This was raw, unfiltered leadership displayed in real time. In the days that followed, analysts argued over the political implications. Some said it was a blow to Piñera's image, proof that his loud, combative style could be punctured. Others insisted it was just another viral moment destined to fade when the next controversy hit. But outside the talking heads and party strategists, ordinary Chileans were taking away something far more personal. In a classroom in Santiago, a teacher asked her students what they learned from the exchange. One boy raised his hand and said, "A veces no tienes que gritar de vuelta, solo tienes que decir la verdad y dejar que hable por sí misma." The teacher smiled, recognizing that the lesson had landed deeper than politics. In a church basement in La Serena, a pastor referenced the clip during his Sunday sermon. "Cuando estás seguro de lo que sabes que es correcto," le dijo a la congregación, "no necesitas gritarlo. La verdad tiene su propio volumen." Heads nodded around the room, people murmuring their agreement. And in living rooms across the country, families used the moment as a springboard for conversations with their kids. Parents explained that leadership isn't about ego or showmanship. It's about humility, conviction, clarity, and respect. Kids listened, replaying the clip on their phones, processing the difference between noise and wisdom. The irony, of course, was that Boric hadn't prepared for any of this. He hadn't gone into the town hall expecting a confrontation. The line wasn't a rehearsed punchline. It came out of his instinct to steady the conversation. That authenticity was what gave it weight. People can spot rehearsed lines. This one carried the ring of truth. For Piñera, the moment was harder to shake. His allies worked overtime, flooding airwaves with counter-narratives, insisting Boric had been disrespectful or that the event was staged. But the clip was too strong, the reaction too visceral. People weren't debating statistics anymore. They were talking about tone, about character, about who looked like a leader when it mattered most. The broader lesson reached beyond politics. Coaches used it to remind athletes that bragging about winning isn't the same as earning respect. Managers and offices shared it as an example of staying calm under pressure. Parents pointed to it as proof that bullies thrive on noise, but they falter when someone refuses to play their game. And for millions of Chileans, it stirred something deeper. Nostalgia for a style of leadership rooted in composure and principle, rather than chaos and spectacle. At the heart of it all was a simple truth. Words matter, how you say them matters, and in a country often drowned in shouting, one sentence delivered with composure could echo louder than hours of bluster. That's why the clip stuck. That's why it spread. It wasn't just that Boric had won the exchange. It was that he reminded people that winning, in the truest sense, isn't about dominating an opponent. It's about lifting a standard for everyone watching. As one political analyst put it on Radio Cooperativa, no fue Boric versus Piñera, fue compostura versus chaos, y la compostura ganó. For the audience in Santiago, for the millions watching at home, and for the countless others who would see the clip later online, the takeaway was clear. Real strength isn't in the shouting, it's in the steadiness. And maybe that's the lesson worth carrying beyond politics into classrooms, workplaces, families, and friendships. The loudest voice in the room isn't always the strongest. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay calm, tell the truth, and let the world decide for itself. So if you are watching this right now, ask yourself, in your own life, when the noise gets loud, when tempers flare, when someone tries to rattle you, will you match the volume or will you hold your ground with calm? Because history shows us that calm wins. If this story spoke to you, if it reminded you that words matter and composure carries weight, then don't forget to subscribe. More stories like this are waiting, and each one carries a truth we can all learn from. Stay steady, stay honest, and let the truth do the talking.